My husband didn't see me crying at his promotion party until his boss asked if I was all right. Then he turned around. The champagne tower sparkled under crystal chandeliers, and I stood next to it, counting my breaths because my therapist said that's what you do. When panic attacks start building like storm systems you can feel approaching but can't stop. 43 minutes I'd been standing in this exact spot at the Ritz-Carlton ballroom while Michael worked the room like he was campaigning for office, and not once had he glanced in my direction. My feet screamed in the heels his assistant picked out because my usual flats weren't appropriate for his big night. The dress was his choice too. Navy sheath his mother approved via FaceTime, sophisticated enough to compliment him without drawing attention. That phrase kept echoing in my head, without drawing attention, like I was a piece of furniture meant to blend seamlessly into his carefully curated life. Someone approached asking about Michael's partnership plans and whether we'd be moving to that bigger house in Riverside, and I realized with a jolt that everyone at this party knew about a house my husband was planning to buy except me. When had he looked at houses? Had I been there? The memories felt slippery, like trying to hold water in cupped hands, and I couldn't tell anymore what I'd actually experienced versus what Michael had told me happened. The tears started without warning, hot and mortifying, sliding down my cheeks while across the room Michael threw his head back laughing at something Richard Whitmore said. That laugh carried over the ambient party noise and hit me like a physical blow because I couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed like that with me, fully present and genuinely delighted instead of distracted by his phone or already thinking 3 steps ahead to his next professional move. I turned toward the champagne tower and pretended to study the glasses, using my hair as a curtain to hide my face, trying desperately to pull myself together because this was Michael's night and I was not going to be the wife who made a scene. Except I was already making a scene, wasn't I? Standing here crying at my husband's promotion party while he remained completely oblivious 20 feet away. A waiter passed with concerned eyes, and I shook my head slightly to indicate I was fine, and we both knew I was lying. The panic in my chest built higher, that feeling like the air was too thick to breathe properly, and I gripped the edge of the table hard enough that my knuckles went white. Dr. Reeves had warned me about this, about how anxiety manifests when you've been ignoring your own needs for so long that your body starts screaming what your mind won't acknowledge. Count to 4 breathing in, 6 breathing out. But it wasn't working because the room felt like it was tilting and I couldn't find anywhere safe to look. Then a woman appeared next to me, young, maybe late 20s, wearing a server's uniform with dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly, and something about the genuine concern in her voice made my throat tighten even more. I nodded automatically because that's what you do when strangers ask uncomfortable questions, but she didn't move away. Instead, she handed me a clean handkerchief from her pocket, and her brown eyes held something that looked almost like recognition, like she'd stood exactly where I was standing and understood in a way that didn't require explanation. "I've been watching you stand here alone for half an hour," she said, glancing briefly at Michael across the room. "And I don't think anyone else has noticed you're here at all, which seems really wrong at a party that's supposedly celebrating both of you." The words hit like she'd reached into my chest and squeezed my heart, articulating something I'd been feeling but couldn't name, and suddenly I was crying harder despite my desperate attempts to stop. "It's his night," I managed to say through the tears. "I'm just here to support him." The woman's expression shifted to something between sympathy and anger. "Supporting someone doesn't mean disappearing completely," she said, and those words lodged in my brain like a splinter I couldn't remove, painful and impossible to ignore. Before I could respond, Richard Whitmore's voice boomed through the sound system calling for attention, and the room gradually quieted as everyone turned toward the small stage at the front. Michael made his way through the crowd accepting congratulations, his face glowing with satisfaction, and climbed the steps to embrace Richard in that masculine half-hug, before turning to face his audience. The woman next to me hadn't moved, and I realized she was watching this unfold with clinical observation, like she was cataloging details for later analysis. Michael launched into a speech he'd clearly been preparing for weeks, thanking the firm and mentioning specific partners who'd mentored him, talking about sacrifice and dedication and late nights and difficult cases. Then he said something that made my stomach turn. "I'm grateful for the strong foundation at home that allows me to focus completely on my work." The words sounded thoughtful and appreciative, but standing there with tears wet on my cheeks and a stranger's handkerchief clutched in my hand, all I could hear was the truth underneath. I'd become furniture in our house, present but unnoticed unless Michael needed something specific. The applause was thunderous when he finished his speech, raising his champagne glass in a toast. "To partnerships, both professional and personal," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd, but somehow never landing on me despite standing in direct line from the stage. "And to the people who make our success possible." More applause, more congratulations, and Michael descended into a swarm of people wanting to celebrate him. Richard Whitmore approached me then, his wife Helen beside him, both wearing polished smiles that faltered slightly when they got close enough to see my face. "You must be so proud," Helen said, touching my arm lightly, and I opened my mouth to agree, but what came out instead was a choked sob I tried to disguise as a cough. Richard's executive instincts clearly sensed something was wrong even if he couldn't identify what, and his voice dropped from public volume to genuine concern. "Are you all right?" he asked. And that question asked by my husband's boss at my husband's promotion party while my husband stood 20 feet away completely oblivious, finally broke something inside me that had been cracking for months. The tears came harder now, impossible to hide, and I watched Helen's eyes widen as she realized this wasn't emotional pride about the promotion. I was actually falling apart right in front of them. Richard's expression shifted to something more serious as he glanced toward Michael, clearly wondering why the guest of honor's wife was crying while he celebrated. "Michael," Richard called out, his voice carrying that executive authority that had quieted the entire room earlier, and the noise level dropped noticeably as people turned to see what was happening. I wanted to sink through the floor rather than be the center of attention, but it was too late because Michael's head was turning toward us, confusion crossing his face as he tried to understand why his boss was interrupting his celebration. I watched him take in the scene, his wife standing with his boss and clearly upset, clearly crying, and the confusion transformed into something between concern and irritation, like he couldn't decide if this was genuine emergency or inconvenient interruption. He excused himself and crossed the room, his jaw tight in a way I recognized from other times I'd embarrassed him in front of important people. And the party continued around us, but with that weird hovering energy of people trying not to obviously stare while absolutely paying attention. Michael reached us and immediately put his arm around my waist in a gesture that looked supportive but felt possessive, his fingers digging into my side slightly as he smiled at Richard and Helen. "Everything okay over here?" he asked, voice carefully neutral but with an undercurrent suggesting I better have a good explanation. Richard cleared his throat, obviously uncomfortable with the domestic situation he'd inadvertently created. "I think your wife might need a moment," he said carefully. "Perhaps some fresh air?" It was an obvious lie to give us privacy, and Helen picked up on it immediately, steering her husband toward the terrace doors. Michael waited until they were out of earshot before his arm dropped from my waist, his expression shifting from public concern to private frustration. "What's going on?" he demanded, voice low and tense. "This is my promotion party and you're crying in front of my boss? Do you have any idea how that looks?" Not asking what was wrong, not asking if I was hurt or sick, just worried about appearances and professional reputation exactly like always. The woman in the server's uniform had disappeared, but her handkerchief was still crumpled in my hand, evidence that a complete stranger had shown me more genuine concern in 5 minutes than my husband had shown in months. "I can't do this anymore," I heard myself say, the words coming out steady despite tears still running down my face. "I can't keep standing next to you while you pretend I don't exist unless someone else notices first." Michael's face cycled through expressions, confusion, defensiveness, anger, before settling on condescending patience. "You're being dramatic," he said, glancing around to see if anyone could hear us. "I've been networking, which is literally the point of tonight. You knew this was important for my career." The way he said my career instead of our future told me everything about how he viewed our marriage, and I felt something shift inside me, a decision crystallizing that I hadn't even realized I was making. "I stood in the same spot for almost an hour, Michael, and you didn't look at me once until your boss asked if I was okay." He had the decency to look slightly guilty before defensiveness kicked back in. "That's not fair. I can't be expected to monitor your emotional state every second when I'm trying to make partner," which I did, by the way, in case you forgot what tonight is about. The casual cruelty of it, the suggestion my feelings were an inconvenient distraction from his achievement, made me laugh, a sharp, bitter sound that didn't match the elegant ballroom or classical music playing softly in the background. "Let's go outside," he said through clenched teeth, gripping my elbow firm enough to make his desire for me to lower my voice very clear. "We're not having this conversation in the middle of my party." He steered me through the crowd toward the terrace doors, and I caught glimpses of confused and curious faces as we passed, feeling strange detachment like I was watching this happen to someone else. The terrace was empty except for Richard and Helen pretending very hard not to notice us emerging, and Michael waved them off with a tight smile before they made hasty exit back inside. The night air was cool against my flushed skin, and I could hear traffic mixing with muted party noise, creating a strange soundtrack for what I was increasingly certain would be the end of my marriage. Michael released my elbow and turned to face me, his executive composure cracking enough to show genuine anger underneath. "What the hell is your problem tonight?" he demanded, voice no longer modulated for professional settings. "You've been weird for weeks and now you're making a scene at the most important event of my career? What do you want from me?" The question hung in the air between us, and I realized he genuinely didn't understand. His confusion wasn't manipulation. He honestly had no idea what I needed because he'd never thought to ask. "I want you to see me," I said simply, my voice steady now that we were away from audience inside. "I want you to notice when I'm struggling without someone else pointing it out first. I want to matter to you as much as your career does." Michael ran his hand through his hair, gesture I recognized from 1,000 arguments where he couldn't understand why I was upset about something perfectly reasonable to him. "You do matter to me," he said automatically, like a line from a script he'd memorized but didn't fully understand. "Why do you think I work so hard? I'm building a future for us, providing security. But you knew what you were signing up for when you married a lawyer. There it was. The assumption that sacrifice meant I should simply disappear into background of his life, existing only to make things easier for him, while my own needs became increasingly irrelevant. "I didn't sign up to be invisible," I said, pulling his grandmother's engagement ring off my finger, the diamond catching light from ballroom windows. "I signed up to be your partner, someone you actually see and care about. But that's not what this is anymore." Michael's eyes went wide as he registered what I was doing, his hand reaching out instinctively like he could stop me through sheer force of will. "Don't be ridiculous," he said sharply, voice edged with fear that comes from losing control. "You're upset, you're emotional, but you don't mean this. Put the ring back on, and we'll talk tomorrow when you're thinking clearly." The implication that I wasn't thinking clearly, that my valid feelings were just emotional overreaction that would pass with time, made my decision feel even more right despite how terrifying it was. "I'm thinking more clearly right now than I have in years," I told him, holding out the ring. "What I see clearly is I've been trying to earn your attention for so long that I forgot I shouldn't have to earn it in the first place." He didn't take the ring, just stared at it like it was a bomb I was trying to hand him, mind clearly racing through arguments and counterpoints the way it would in courtroom. "You're throwing away our marriage because I was busy at my own promotion party?" he finally said, tone shifting to something between disbelief and contempt. "Every wife here understands these events are about supporting their husbands' careers, but you're making it about you instead." The casual sexism of that statement, assumption that my role was purely supportive while his was important, crystallized everything wrong with our relationship into one perfect example. "Every wife here might be okay with being invisible, but I'm not anymore," I said, setting the ring down on the stone railing since he refused to take it. "And the fact that you think wanting my husband to notice I'm crying is making it about me tells me everything I need to know." I turned to walk away, but Michael grabbed my wrist, lawyer instincts kicking in to negotiate and convince. "Wait," he said, and for the first time all evening he actually looked at me. Really looked, scanning my face like seeing me for the first time in months. "You're serious about this?" I gently pulled my wrist from his grip, not roughly but firmly enough that he understood I was done being held in place. "I'm going home to pack some things. You can stay and enjoy your celebration." The bitterness in my tone was unmistakable, but I was beyond caring about protecting his feelings when mine had been disregarded for so long. Michael's face cycled through emotions too quickly for me to track, landing eventually on something that looked almost like understanding, though whether he actually understood or just realized he couldn't talk his way out remained unclear. "Can we at least discuss this like adults instead of you running away?" he asked, and I almost laughed at the characterization of me leaving as running away when I'd stayed and tried and communicated for years while he'd been too busy to listen. "We've been discussing it, Michael. You just weren't paying attention." I walked back toward the ballroom doors and he followed, both of us re-entering the party still going strong, people laughing and drinking and celebrating while our marriage ended 20 feet away on a terrace. The woman in the server's uniform was standing near the entrance, and our eyes met for just a moment, long enough for her to give me a small nod that felt like approval or support, or acknowledgement she'd witnessed something important. I collected my coat while Michael stood frozen in the doorway, clearly trying to decide whether to follow me or return to his party, and I watched him choose the party, his professional instincts winning out over whatever personal feelings he might have had. The Uber ride home took 20 minutes, and I spent it staring out the window at city lights blurring past, feeling simultaneously numb and hyper-aware of every sensation. My phone buzzed constantly with texts from Michael, starting with anger, then shifting to bargaining, then landing on dismissive, but I didn't respond to any of them. The house was dark when I arrived, everything exactly as we'd left it, all the mundane detritus of a life that had looked normal from outside while slowly suffocating me from within. I pulled my largest suitcase from the closet, the same one we'd used for our honeymoon to Italy 4 years ago, when Michael had still occasionally looked at me the way he'd looked at Richard Whitmore tonight, and started packing systematically. My phone continued buzzing with increasingly frustrated texts, including one that said Richard had asked if everything was okay, and Michael had to lie and say I wasn't feeling well, making my legitimate feelings into an illness he had to explain away. That message confirmed I was making the right decision, that Michael viewed my unhappiness not as a problem to solve but as PR issue to manage. I was loading my suitcase into my car when headlights swept across the driveway, and Michael's BMW pulled in behind me, blocking my exit. He got out quickly, tie loosened and hair disheveled, and for a moment I felt a flicker of hope that maybe he'd finally understood. "We need to talk," he said, hands up in placating gesture. "You can't just leave without discussing this. We made vows, and you're throwing that away because of one bad party?" The reduction of everything wrong with our marriage to one bad party was so perfectly Michael that I almost appreciated the clarity. "This isn't about one party," I said, leaning against my car. "This is about a pattern building for years. If your own boss has to ask if your wife is okay before you notice she's crying, we don't have a marriage. We have a professional arrangement where I provide domestic support, and you provide financial security, and that's not enough anymore." Michael's expression shifted to genuine frustration, lawyer facade cracking. "What do you want me to say? That I'm sorry I was focused on my promotion at my promotion party? That seems pretty unreasonable." The fact that he still couldn't see the difference between monitoring me and simply noticing I existed made continuing feel pointless. "I wanted you to see me, Michael. Actually see me as a person you care about rather than a supporting character. And the fact that you can't understand the difference is exactly why I'm leaving." I moved toward my car door, but he blocked it, body language aggressive in a way I'd never seen, desperation making him less careful. "You're not leaving," he said, and it wasn't request but command. "We're going inside and having a rational conversation like adults who made a commitment." The word rational in that sentence, suggestion that what bothered me wasn't real or valid, made me see clearly how fundamental our disconnect was. "Move, Michael," I said quietly, and something in my voice convinced him because he stepped back. "I'm staying at the Marriott downtown. My lawyer will contact yours next week about separation paperwork." I got in my car and backed out while he stood watching, his face mixture of disbelief and anger, and something that might have been first genuine feeling he'd shown all night. The Marriott's night clerk checked me in without comment, and I rode the elevator feeling simultaneously exhausted and more awake than I'd been in years. My phone buzzed with calls I declined, then text messages that devolved from reasoning to outright anger. "You're being childish," one read. "Fine. Take a few days to cool off, but we're going to work this out whether you like it or not." The presumption that I would eventually come around showed how completely he'd misunderstood not just tonight but our entire relationship. I blocked his number and called my best friend Avery, who answered despite it being almost midnight. "I left Michael," I said without preamble, and heard her sharp intake of breath followed by silence that stretched long enough to worry me. But then she said, "Thank God, I've been waiting for you to do that for 2 years." and I started crying again, but this time from relief. Avery showed up at my hotel room 30 minutes later with wine and tissues and righteous anger, letting herself in with the spare key I'd arranged. "Tell me everything," she demanded, and I did, the whole story spilling out while she listened with progressively more outraged expression. When I finished, she pulled out her phone and started scrolling through old texts, showing me messages she'd sent our mutual friend analyzing incidents I'd dismissed, but she'd recognized as patterns of emotional neglect. "Remember your birthday last year when he forgot until his assistant reminded him? Or the health scare when he missed your doctor appointment for a deposition? Or every holiday when he's been on his phone the entire time?" Each example brought back memories I'd filed under not ideal, but understandable, and seeing them together made the pattern impossible to deny. "Why didn't you say something?" I asked, feeling gratitude and frustration. Avery squeezed my hand. "I tried multiple times, but you weren't ready to hear it. I've watched enough friends and bad relationships to know you can't force someone to leave before they're ready. You can only be there when they finally are." She was right, I realized. All those times she'd made subtle comments about Michael's priorities, I'd brushed them off, too invested in maintaining the illusion. We made a plan: lawyer recommendations, financial advisors, therapists, places I could stay long-term. "First thing tomorrow, you're calling Diana Sherman, best divorce attorney in the city, specializes in cases where one spouse is a lawyer trying to manipulate the process." We stayed up until 3 making plans and occasionally crying, recognizing that while necessary, this was still the end of something I'd believed would last forever. Sleep came eventually, and I woke around 10 to sunlight and disorientation before events came flooding back. My phone had 37 missed calls and too many texts from Michael, his mother, his sister, several colleagues enlisted in the campaign to convince me to come home. I ignored them all and called Diana Sherman's office, somehow getting consultation that afternoon at 3. The meeting happened in corner office with city view and walls covered in diplomas. Diana listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, and when I finished, she leaned back and said something unexpected. "I know Michael Harrington professionally. He's excellent, which means this will be difficult because he'll use every tool to maintain control. But it also means he'll be overconfident and make mistakes because lawyers are terrible at recognizing when they need counsel rather than representing their own interests." She outlined aggressive but fair strategy, focusing on equitable asset division and protecting me from his inevitable attempts to frame divorce as my fault. "The promotion party incident actually works in your favor. Multiple witnesses saw you in distress, saw his boss intervene, saw him prioritize the party over your well-being. His own boss will likely be sympathetic if this gets contentious, which it probably will. We spent 2 hours on finances and documentation, and I left feeling terrified and empowered." Michael's texts became increasingly desperate over the next days, cycling through anger, bargaining, victim playing, and threats. "You're destroying my professional reputation," one read. "My mother is devastated. You're abandoning all of us over nothing," said another. Diana advised not responding, just documenting everything, letting Michael's unhinged messages build a case for his true character. The divorce papers were served at his office, choice Diana made specifically because his professional pride would be wounded by colleagues knowing his personal life was falling apart. His response was immediate and vindictive. Counter-petition claiming I'd abandoned the marriage without cause and seeking full credit for all assets since he was primary earner. Diana had anticipated this with counter-documentation ready, detailed records of emotional neglect and financial control painting picture of marriage failing long before the party. The legal battle stretched across months, and there were times I questioned whether leaving had been worth the cost. But then I'd remember standing in that ballroom crying while Michael laughed across the room, completely unaware and unconcerned, and I'd know I'd made the right choice. The woman from the party somehow found my contact through social media. "I don't know if you remember me, but I wanted you to know I'm proud of you for leaving. I watched my mother stay in a marriage like yours for 30 years and she lost herself completely. You were brave enough to choose yourself." The settlement took 8 months, longer than projected because Michael fought every point out of spite. In the end, I got half of what we'd accumulated, less than I deserved but more than Michael wanted, so Diana called it a win. Walking out of courthouse after final hearing, I felt lighter than I had in years, like I'd been carrying Michael's expectations and finally set them down. A year after the promotion party, I ran into Richard Whitmore at a coffee shop and he recognized me immediately. "I owe you an apology," he said. "That night at Michael's party, I should have done more than just ask if you were all right." I thanked him, but told him honestly that his asking had been enough, had forced Michael to finally look at me and see what everyone else had seen. Richard nodded and said something surprising. Michael's partnership didn't work out how he'd hoped. His focus on appearance over substance became a problem with clients, and he's been passed over for several major cases. Sometimes people get so good at performing success they forget to build something real. I'd rebuilt my marketing career with a firm that valued work-life balance, and for first time in years I was excited about work rather than going through motions. The apartment I'd found was small but mine, decorated exactly how I wanted, filled with plants and color and life in a way my house with Michael never had been. I'd started dating someone named Owen who noticed things like when I was quiet or seemed stressed, who asked questions and listened to answers and treated my feelings like they mattered. The contrast between Owen's attentiveness and Michael's obliviousness sometimes made me cry, not from sadness but relief that I'd finally found what healthy relationship looked like. 2 years after the promotion party, I got a message from the server from the Ritz. "I don't know if you remember me, but I've thought about you often. I'm getting married next month and wanted to invite you because what you did that night showed me what real strength looks like." I went to her wedding with Owen, and during reception she found me and hugged me tight. "Thank you for leaving that night," she said quietly. I'd been in similar situation with my ex, And watching you walk away gave me permission to do the same few months later. Sometimes we need to see someone else be brave before we can find our own courage. I hugged her back and told her she'd been brave first by asking if I was okay when no one else had. That's when I realized the ripple effects of choosing yourself, how one moment of courage could inspire others to find their own, how leaving didn't just save you but potentially saved everyone who witnessed it and recognized their own struggles reflected back. My husband didn't see me crying at his promotion party until his boss asked if I was all right, and then he turned around. But by that point, I'd already seen clearly enough for both of us that our marriage was over. Sometimes the most important moment isn't when someone finally notices you, it's when you notice yourself being ignored and decide you're worth more than that. Appreciate you watching this far. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.